Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining today. So I'm very pleased to welcome Farhad Billimoria for the system seminar today. Farhad has a bunch of experience in investing and finance for energy and infrastructure. First in New York, then in California for CalPERS, the management fund for the public employee retirement system. Yeah. In California. And then back in Australia as well. More recently, he's been working at the Australian electricity market operator, which is really at the forefront of thinking about how the system needs to change to evolve to relying on more solar and wind in particular. And then after all that experience, he decided that he would get a doctorate at Oxford as well. So he's currently working on that. And consistently writing, in my opinion, some of the most interesting academic papers on electricity markets, given the wealth of experience from finance and regulatory and market operations. So very happy to have him here, and I'm going to cede the floor to Farhad.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Jacob. That's a very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's especially nice to sort of see the fall colors here. I used to be based in Connecticut, and really miss that's one thing you really miss in Australia. You just get when the summer comes, it's just it's very hot, and then we just get very, very rainy and wintry weather in Melbourne. So we don't get these beautiful fall colors. So it's nice to be here. Really, what I'd like to talk to you today about is a way of thinking about translating complex engineering issues in the power system and electricity systems to the economics and to thinking about things like markets and regulation. And just as a bit of a show of hands, how many folks in the room are from a sort of an electrical engineering background or power systems background? Okay, so a handful. So just in terms of how I talk about the issues, if I go too fast or I'm jumping over things too quickly in terms of assumed knowledge, just pull me back and ask some questions on it. And just before I get into it, just a quick acknowledgement of my co-authors on this work, which was Professor Pierluigi Mancarella and Dr. Raman Pudine. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the challenge of integrating renewable resources, in particular resources that are connected really with a new interface in the grid, and how that impacts both the engineering and also how that impacts the economics. And what we're going to be focusing on is a way of thinking about translating the engineering to the economics, and what are the policy implications of that. So why system? So when what I'm focusing on today, when we're talking about the integration of resources, is really the reliability of electricity systems. So we are going to have a proliferation of new types of resources, primarily wind and solar, into our electricity systems. And I think we can probably safely say that is going to be a given, given the policy shifts in many major markets. So we are going to experience more and more wind and solar. Now, in accordance with the original energy trilemma, that's not the only thing we need to do. We need to make sure that system and that delivery of electricity is secure and reliable. Now, when we're talking about system security, what we're really talking about is the resilience of a system, of an electricity system, to different types of disturbances. How do we ensure that essentially the lights stay on when you get different types of disturbances in the system? And this is one example of where it didn't in South Australia in 2016, where you had a windy but not a very worrisome day for control room operators. That quickly turned into wind gusts, record wind gusts, failure of protection systems, faults on lines, transmission towers falling down, and ultimately a disconnection of the South Australian grid from the rest of the market. And so you had the South Australian grid out for a big part of the day, and some parts of the grid took months to actually reconnect. So big impacts when you have insecure systems. Now, what are some of the challenges associated with integrating new resources to the system? Well, one which receives a lot of focus is the issue of variability uncertainty. Obviously, sun only shines at particular times of the day, and the wind blows when it blows. So that's an important part. What we're going to be focusing on today is actually the nature of the interface. So what I'm concerned about applies to both solar, wind, as well as technologies like battery technologies coming to the grid. The way in which these resources interface with the grid is fundamentally different to traditional technologies. Traditional technologies are based on the idea of synchronous turbines, big spinning masses in the system, and so they connect through that electromechanical interconnection into the grid. Wind and solar and batteries connect through power electronics. And that has fundamental implications for security because, and this is a model of a very simplified high-level model of the way in which first generation renewable systems integrated. It's through what's essentially called, actually to just maybe simplify it, it's basically relying on voltage phase measurements to synchronize DC power into grid compatible AC power. So it's actually using measurements from the grid. It actually requires a secure and resilient grid to be able to synchronize with the system. And so when we have this sort of shift in interface, what we actually realized is that there were characteristics of the legacy systems that actually helped system security. So two of the big services that were actually provided by synchronous turbines are inertia and system strength. And I'll talk about what they are in a second. But when you fundamentally changed the nature of the interface, all of a sudden you started seeing these technical scarcities that you never saw in the system before. So inertia is something that essentially is associated with the mass, the spinning mass of these big heavy turbines sitting in the system. And when you have less of those in the system, what actually happens is when you get disturbances to active power generation, the frequency degrades in a much quicker way. So it degrades in a much more volatile way than if you actually had inertia in the system. So you can think of inertia essentially being a big cushion or a big handbrake on the system when disturbances happen. And one important thing to just talk about with inertia is that it actually involves trade-offs. It's not just about, you can substitute inertia for different types of response. So it's not a one-for-one. If you lose inertia in the system, that you've got to have inertia put back. You can substitute, and this is known as frequency envelopes in work done by Puchel and Pierluigi Mancarella, is that there's actually trade-offs involved in ensuring system security. So you can substitute inertia with a degree of primary frequency response, but you need to be able to enable that as well. So it's important that when we're thinking about managing security that there are these operational trade-offs. It's not only about frequency. Voltage is also a key consideration. And one of the issues that we're observing, especially in the Australian grid, which is really long and stringy, is that system strength matters. So system strength is essentially a very high-level term, and it's something that describes and reflects the sensitivity of the voltage parameter, so both magnitude, phase angle, wave shape, in response to disturbances. So if you don't have high system strength, what you end up with is a lot of undesirable behavior in grids. So oscillations, for example, in Western Victoria, you get potentially failure of protection systems, of control systems, and all sorts of things can go wrong. Now, synchronous generation has an inherent contribution to system strength. Once again, due to the very nature of the engineering of those types of technologies, when you get a disturbance, you get a natural response in terms of dynamic reactive support. And this is again, so once you start taking synchronous generation out of the system, you get degradations in the strength of the system. This is one parameter by looking at fault levels, is what you can observe is that the penetration of renewables is really shifting the amount of time that you have strength in the system. So a lot of the times you're operating under a weak grid condition. Another challenge with system security is that power system parameters are increasingly interactive and unpredictable. And a couple of examples here. One is an event we experienced in Australia in 2018, where we had a cascading event and separation between different parts of the grid. Initially, we had some lightning strikes in Queensland. That resulted in a trip of the connection between Queensland and the rest of the grid. And what happened was, because of the way transmission flows were actually happening, Queensland experienced overfrequency and the rest of the market experienced underfrequency. Then what happened was you had response from primary response and control systems and load protection systems trying to boost that frequency back up. But you actually had a bit of overshoot in South Australia. It responded actually too well, including the performance of, you may have heard of the famous Elon Musk Hornsdale battery. That responded, as well as a range of other resources responded. And so what you ended up getting was overfrequency in South Australia. And South Australia then disconnected from the system. So you had a cascading island situation, and just illustrating the complexities of it. Another type of complexity is the interdependence between voltage and frequency. We've traditionally thought of those, or at least thought about it from an operational perspective as separate. But you actually can have now interaction between these two parameters. If you get a fault and a voltage deviation, that can shift the way in which different types of resources respond to that deviation, and that can result in active power changes in the market, which affects frequency. So there's a lot more interactivity between different parameters in the system. And so these are a high-level view of some of the challenges that we have with managing system security. So this is a area which is receiving a lot of engineering focus, a high degree of attention to getting the right control systems in place. And it's not just one solution. There are an array of technical solutions that are available here. But how do we actually incentivize that? To kind of get some of these new technologies to kind of make sure that we've got the right resources in the right places, we need to think about the economic and market and regulatory frameworks for system security as well. And this is where we kind of need, we also have an array of market instrumentation and regulatory instrumentation that we can use. But the question is, which do we apply to what? And does it even matter? And so the focus of today's talk is really, it's sort of a long motivation, but it's important to sort of characterize why framing the economics is important. Now, we are building upon really the original seminal works that formulated electricity markets that involved an elegant reconciliation between the physics and the economics. But there are some important assumptions made at that time regarding the delivery of security in the system. So things like system strength, inertia. Because every resource delivered system strength and inertia, you kind of didn't need to worry about it that much. As we transition, we now need to think about the delivery of those services and the economics of that. So our approach, we've started to talk about the technical requirements, and I'm just going to characterize that in terms of a value chain. And based on that, we're going to use public good theory to characterize those goods. And what we're going to show is that a lot of the economic goods of system security don't neatly fall into sort of this private or public distinction. They actually kind of fall somewhere in the middle. And that means that we need to think about what that means for policy instrumentation as well. So, and I'll go through this part relatively quickly because it's high level. How do we think about designing new markets? Well, let's just look at actually system security as an end objective, and what are the products and materials that we actually use to get what we want. First of all, we talk about elementary services, so it's really trying to boil it down to the core services that we're looking for, and that's really upwards and downwards, active and reactive power. So we can ascribe that, but even before we take that step, it's important to understand how we deliver active and reactive power. And the way in which that's done is actually quite different in terms of the core control systems for synchronous and asynchronous technology. That then gets, for most services, delivered by a control scheme. So we have control schemes that regulate how active and reactive power is provided. But it's also important to realize that there is an inherent response, and that's the system strength and inertia capabilities that we were talking about before of synchronous technologies. And so if we want power electronics to deliver these services, inertia and system strength, we actually have to reconfigure those control systems to make sure we do that. And to do that, we've got to have the right products and incentives for that in place. So what's the traditional approach to this is we tend to kind of define these products based on certain types of control, and this is what is the conventional approach to designing markets for system security and ancillary services, which are sort of part and parcel of spot markets for electricity really around the world. But one of the important points which I've sort of talked about a little bit here is that these recent events also underscore the criticality of these types of services, which we've kind of assumed away in the existing market structure. And so we need to think about how this is procured as well. To introduce the concept, the economic concept for characterizing these goods, we rely on public good theory. So this is basically a way of thinking about how to characterize from an economic perspective the goods that we actually want delivered. So you'll see there really a distinction between what are called public and private goods. And it's distinguished by two characteristics. One is the excludability of the good. So if you think about the traditional public goods that we think about, for example, national defense is seen as a public good. It's hard to exclude somebody from receiving the benefits of that. When we put it into the system security world, if you're connected to the electricity grid, it's hard to exclude you from receiving the benefits of frequency control. So excludability is a critical element of really defining what category of goods, good or service you fall into. The other is rivalry. And when we talk about rivalry, we're really talking about the impact on the consumability of that good and the value of that good by extending the service to an additional consumer. So if you think about your standard private commodity, like let's take an apple, if you eat that apple, or if you have a supply of apples, someone else comes into that market, you are introducing a degree of scarcity to that market that impacts the enjoyment of that good for the rest of the market. And so the key concept here for rivalry is looking at the marginal cost of extension. What does it cost to extend the good or service to a new user, given a provision of a particular quantity? So the classical view of most power system security services is that they fall into this pure public good basket. And that is generally the way that markets tend to look at these types of goods. We have one-sided markets. The operator decides how much frequency control we want, or how much primary or regulation reserve we want, and it procures that via merit order. One of the important findings in public good theory is the work by particularly Elinor Ostrom, and she won a Nobel Prize for this, is she actually established that it's not just a distinction in public and private, there are other types of these hybrid goods which actually don't fall neatly into this distinction, one of which is common pool resources. And we can think about that, one of the classic example of that is fishing stocks. So if you have a particular stock of fish in a particular region, it's non-excludable, so if you have access to that lake or whatever it is, you can go and take as much as you want from that, but it is rival. So when you take more fish, you impact the availability of fish for everyone else. And this is what's called the tragedy of the commons. So it doesn't fall into this, it falls into this sort of unclear basket of neither market nor state. And that's really where you need adaptive governance frameworks that actually recognize the challenges of that particular resource. And it's a much more localized approach. This was traditionally adopted to issues of resources in indigenous communities around the world as well. So given the new physics is so complex, we shouldn't be surprised that the traditional definition is not always going to apply here. And so in assessing the role of rivalry, one of the findings from the deep theory in this work is that few goods are perfectly non-rival. And in system services, one of the interesting aspects of it is services can begin as non-rival. So if you have an excess of system strength, if you have a strong system, it's non-rival. Having a new connection in the system is not going to impact the quality of service for everyone. But as it becomes more congestible, that's when it starts to become a problem. If you have a highway that's unused, you're not going to get any problems. Everyone just gets there on time. As you have more and more traffic in the system, you're starting to get congestion. And so the types of costs, just to go back a second, what we talked about was this concept of marginal cost of extension. That's really trying to understand what's the cost to extending the service. And there are three types of costs that are established by work by Kay and Praveen Baria. For system security is the availability cost, so the cost of being available for providers to deliver that service, the cost of providers responding to that service, and the risk and cost of outages associated with having an insecure system. So what we do is analyze in this framework, we analyze the impact of adding an additional user on these costs of the system. And that's what allows us to characterize different goods. Another important aspect is who is the typical user? And this is a big challenge in power systems because both generation and load gets the benefit of system security. So if you have a stable frequency, everyone enjoys that. But it's hard to establish who that user is in a particular, at a high level. What we do see is, from a locational perspective and for certain goods, that there is an ability to do that. And ultimately, it's a policy distinction as well. So this is now where we start to apply the physical, understand the implications of the physical relationships for the economics. And this is, so let's look at frequency for products first. This is the classical swing equation. So this is what basically describes the trajectory and the rate of change of frequency in response to disturbances. So the rate of change of frequency is equivalent essentially to this equation here, which describes the power loss. So basically, if you get a disturbance, if a big unit is out of the system, you get a loss of generation, offset by the amount of frequency response, so the amount of control response that actually injects active power back into the system. And then you've got the effects of damping. And H here is your inertia. So the more inertia that you've got in the system, you can actually see that that is inversely proportional to the rate of change. And so this is kind of what describes it. Now, how do we analyze this from an economic perspective? And this is a particular example of contingency frequency response. You can actually see that adding a new system, what happens when you add a new user to the system, what we're really concerned about is, given a particular provision of frequency response and inertia, does it actually impact the rate of change of frequency? Does adding a new user to the system impact the maximal contingency loss? And for the most part, again, if you have sufficient primary response and inertia, it's kind of something which you can potentially assume away. You can basically, you could make an assumption, and again, this is based on the particular system of challenge of concern, is that adding a new user is not going to impact the contingency behavior of the system. And so that's what's driven this view that inertia and contingency FR are best viewed as public goods. But again, what I'd like to do is also just challenge that that's not a fixed view. If you think about the impact of VRE, renewable energy, on variability within a period, and thinking about it from the perspective of regulation services, an argument could be made that having new users, and particularly users that add to the variability of the system impact the enjoyment or the value of that good for the rest of the consumers. And so this is where we think about inertia and contingency FR as public goods, but I'd like to just contrast a couple of different approaches to it. And so this traditional view is basically what has driven the development of a new set of ancillary services for Western Australia. And so we have kind of the world first inertia service that's actually going to be in place and operating. A spot market for inertia that is co-optimized with with other frequency services, primarily contingency. When you look at the national electricity market, which is really the market on the east coast of Australia, this becomes, and while inertia spot markets are a consideration as part of our next phase of market design, the locational impacts of inertia are actually quite relevant, because here we've actually adopted a simplification and an approximation of frequency. In reality, as the power system engineers will actually know, the swing equation actually applies on a nodal basis, right? It applies to the bus, and you're actually looking at phase angle differences. So when the operational challenges for inertia, the locational impacts of inertia are starting to become quite relevant. And so having a centralized system-wide spot market for inertia may actually belie the risks involved in locational provision of inertia. And so what's actually happening for inertia in the national electricity market at the moment is it tends to be still provided through government contracts. And we had the world first, or the first provision of inertia services from the Hornsdale battery, which you may recall was the one that was facilitated by tweets between billionaires, between Elon and one of the Australian billionaires there. Now, how do we think about something like voltage? Now, this is interesting because voltage, it kind of depends on the topology and the congestion in the system. So, again, a simplified version of thinking about voltage is to look at the voltage security, is to look at the traditional Nose code for voltage. And what this says is you want to be operating in the stable region, and there's a stability margin based on where your active power is in the system and what voltage you're operating at, and how far you are from the critical point, which is really the point of voltage collapse. Now, if you are operating, let's say, at point 8, which has a high stability margin, adding a new user is unlikely to kind of bring you closer to, much closer to voltage collapse. And so you can kind of look at this as, potentially a pretty non-rival situation. Contrast this with operating in a congested region where you're very close to the stability margin. Here, adding an additional user would actually impact quite significantly the stability and the level of cushion and comfort that you have in the system. And so this is where we think about voltage as really a rival or potentially congestible good. And this is kind of driving a view that we need to think about this really from a common pool resource perspective rather than a simple distinction between public goods. System strength. So this is, again, a simplification, and what I'm showing you here is an illustration. Again, power system engineers will whack me over the head for talking about available fault level as a metric for system strength, because it is a highly simplified, non-granular metric. And so just recognizing that, but it is something that planners use as a way of thinking about strength of the system. And so again, here what we've got is some analysis from AEMO system strength requirements methodology report in 2020. And this shows essentially the available fault level. So you need to have fault level above 0, for example, to think about, to have essentially be a secure, a strong node or a strong part of the grid. The addition of new resources, and this is a model of the fault levels across a variety of contiguous nodes, looking at the existing system and adding a new asynchronous generator to that system. And what you can see is the addition of a new resource affects not only the node at the strength at the particular node, but it also affects the surrounding nodes. Now, where there is sufficient strength in the system and it's not congested, adding in a new resource doesn't really impact because you've got sufficient available fault level to deal with. Where it does become a problem is where you're really operating at those limits, where the addition of a new resource does impact the system. And so again, we come to this characterization of congestible CPRs. One thing I will note, we're only scratching the surface of the complexity of constraint formulations for system strength. This is a deep area of technical research, both from an academic perspective as well as from a practical market operator perspective. And so we just caveat these, what we're trying to show is the broad principle at play. We need to get into the detail here for sort of understand that condition more specifically as well. And so what this leads to, in terms of thinking about system security, and particularly the economics of system security, is that rather than everything falling into one category, it is actually a basket of goods. It is with different characteristics. Certain goods may still be quite acceptable to think about them as public goods, but especially as you get to congestion, this is where some of the traditional definitions may start to fray at the edges a little bit. And so the technical complexity of of system security underscores the economic complexity. There are a multitude of technical characteristics, means that you've got different economic characteristics as well of different goods. And you've got to think about some of the detail around the implications for designing markets or regulation. The separability of goods is a key issue. So, for example, with system strength and inertia, in traditional synchronous resources, they are delivered together. So they are delivered as a consequence of the unit being on. So it's a function of unit commitment. It can't be scaled. This is where some of the advantages of new advanced inverter controls is the potential for scale deliverability of system strength and reactive support in the market and inertial support. The link between network access and market. So adding a new user to the system, this is where we're talking about rivalry. How does it impact the service for everyone else? And ultimately, what's the incentives for the right investment? Either from assets and equipment that is targeted towards the delivery of, for example, just system strength, or the control systems that apply to resources that are connected, new users that are connecting. So grid advanced inverter technology can provide some of these services, but it's a coordination challenge. So as I mentioned, markets are potentially easier to develop for these categories, and this is where it kind of becomes more complicated because of this issue of the tragedy of the commons. Now, what does this mean for procurement? What does this actually mean, and does it actually have an effect? And I'll just contrast this with the case of system strength procurement. So again, if you look back to everything prior to 2017, system strength was not really a challenge in the NEM. And so the traditional approach was to just centralize it. Primary responsibility was delegated to the transmission networks. You had the advantage of coordination of technical delivery and procurement. Now, what the challenges were was as you had more renewables connecting to the system, and particularly asynchronous technologies, you had a challenge of coordination of access and investment. So the network provider looking ahead couldn't tell you how much system strength or how much to reinforce the system for system strength and inertia, because it didn't necessarily control the level of access. And so that's where the coordination challenge became an issue. Another issue which complicated this was a lack of inverter-based penetration targets. So the transmission operator, in building out new augmentation of the system, really had no objective to pin themselves to. What are we actually targeting against in terms of non-synchronous penetration? And so that became a challenge. So from 2017 onwards, the market moved to essentially a private delegation into, we shifted all of the obligations essentially to the connecting generators under a provision called do no harm. So what that framework said is if you're connecting, you need to basically remediate the harm that you cause to a system. The advantage of that was polluter pays principle. If you harm everybody else's pool, you tend to pay for it. And remediation essentially as a condition of access. Again, the challenges involved with that was that it led to a significant cost burden on the marginal resource. So if you think about rivalry and congestibility, when there was when systems were strong, the cost was minimal. Nobody had to do much to connect to the system. As you got to congestion, all of a sudden the operator said to that last resource, well, sorry, you're going to push the system over the edge. Can you go and build a new synchronous condenser that costs you 80 million, please, in this location? Now, one of the challenges of that is that from a private perspective, that participant is saying, well, yes, I can build that, but that also benefits everybody else in the system. Am I getting any benefits from that? And so that's what's the challenge. And so this is the new governance framework that is going to apply from 2025, which was really a recognition of the CPR nature of system strength. And it facilitated the coordination of system and resource investment. And so this is where system strength was integrated with network augmentation under this concept of renewable energy zones, which was really a sort of a coordinated approach, but a localized coordinated approach to the development of renewable energy assets. Important elements of this framework include the grouping of coordination of access. So it's not just one resource connecting at a time. A whole group of them will connect, and the system will be augmented to recognize that. Cost incentives for better control. So if you had advanced inverter technology, that's reflected in the charging of remediation and augmentation for system strength. And then obligations for good faith control system tuning. Now, some of the issues with system strength can be remediated through better control and tuning of inverters in an area. And so having that as an obligation or a good faith obligation is also an important part of this adaptive governance approach. And so you can actually see that affects, this sort of framework has an impact in terms of the real world regulation of systems. And so that's kind of the key points, the key takeaways that I'd like, that if you took away just 3 things from this talk. The system's new physical behaviors has direct impacts on the economics, and it actually makes it much more complicated to analyze. A failure to link technical requirements to the economics can risk incentive incompatible design, but it could also delay and burden the energy transition. And so we need to think about suitable technical, market and regulatory measures that are properly suited to the engineering. And that's kind of what I had to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Farhad. So if you're online, I'm monitoring the chat so you can put in a question online. Apart from that, questions from the live audience, we'd be happy to take some. Let's see.
The economic impact in the whole and the complexities of this and everything impact. So at what point, or if there is a point where it's not so interesting being part of this anymore, then you can have a disruptive effect in certain situations. Is that something that we should worry about?
That's a really good point, and I think that's where it kind of there are public and private aspects to that grid as well. Electricity is a network good, and so if you don't have a secure system and a reliable system, your consumers are not actually going to necessarily be interested, especially with the growth of distributed technology, potentially could disconnect from the system. We haven't seen that of any scale as yet, but it is something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And so that, and I think overall it just emphasizes that we need, if we're going to have a network system, we're going to have a network and the delivery of both decentralized and centralized resources, we need to ensure that there is a secure and resilient system in place. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes,
but,
absolutely. And I was thinking that perhaps we could be contemplating hybrid systems where we can administer these variations in
absolutely.
different ways, both technically.
So you talked about how the engineering side can influence the economic side and the need for like different market structures. Can you talk about how it might go in the reverse direction, where how would the economic needs affect design decisions and technology development?
That's a really good point, and I think one of the examples that I can think of the sort of bidirectionality of that is both the potential for positive change and negative change. So one of the impacts of, for example, adopting an approach where you make a centralized decision on what the right solutions are is that it affects potentially the innovation and the market's willingness to adapt to the risks that are presented. So if you say, for example, and I'll come back to that issue of system strength, that we're just going to build out that network, which may be fine, which may potentially be one way of resolving the challenge. What that does is take away that impetus and that incentives from a market perspective as well, unless you have the right governance frameworks that sort of reflect that as well. So it can work in the opposite direction.
So I was wondering, considering that renewable sources are not necessarily available where we have traditional, like even space where right now traditional power plants are situated, the grid obviously is also not necessarily there, and I can see that there's like higher congestion or kind of like congestion issues, and that might hinder renewable energy development. I was wondering how you view this issue in the context of your research.
That's a really good point. And one of the complexities of many aspects of power system security is that they're locational as well as temporal, and the topology of the grid, what type of network you've got, what resources are on at particular points in time affects the delivery of that security. And as you mentioned, where the renewable growth is, especially in Australia, were traditionally areas of the grid with pretty weak connections to the rest of the grid. And so you had a challenge not only for transmission, but for strength of the system. And so early on, or once you had the development of those renewable technologies and projects in parts of that grid, it was unfortunately for many projects an after-the-fact issue, where the operator had either to apply constraints on particular units or to direct other units to come on in place of others to essentially deal with these security issues. And so it can affect investor incentives. In many situations, it can, there's work by, for example, folks like Paul Simshauser, which has shown the impact of delays relating to system strength remediation and security remediation on project level returns. So delays, time, they have the phrase time is money. Time really is money because it can actually affect the investment incentives for these types of projects. So it is important.
can you compare the impact, like, to the overall system security of large, like, solar farms relative to rooftop solar, where the solar is being generated much closer to the need?
It's a really good question. And so for example, transmission, that's one of the key advantages, right, of distributed energy resources. For something like security, it's again a little bit more complex. And I did have an example, but I didn't actually put it in this deck, of one of the challenges in Australia that's being observed is when you get faults on parts of the system, we have observed the disconnection of decentralized resources. So when you get a fault in the system, because the protection systems of, think about your rooftop solar, first of all, it's not always consistent across different manufacturers. There's not that level of sort of standardization. And the resilience to which these systems are built is again different. And so we observed in some cases 20% of, and I hope I've got those statistics right, I'll come back to it if I don't, but up to 20% of disconnections of PV rooftop up to 50 kilometers away from the fault. And so those are some of the complexities that are involved in distributed because of the challenge of standardizing and getting the right control systems in place at that decentralized level as well.
Yeah, I was curious how you, in coming up with what you're going to optimize, and it's a very complicated situation. How do you balance public stakeholders, various people of different influences and so social classes and things, versus investors' interests, versus overall costs to the society of this service? It wasn't clear, in other words, how you would decide what you were going to optimize in an overall view. I could see all the individual things, but I don't see how you. I mean, how does that thought about Australia or in your work?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, and hopefully I can do it justice. I think the trade-offs between different stakeholders in the system is I think is something that it's hard to weight. I think so if you had like a central objective function, how would you weight consumers' benefit versus the system? But I think one of the consumers' benefit versus participants. But I think one of the unifying aspects of system security is that all participants in the system benefit from a secure system. So the ultimate objective of making sure that the system is resilient to or frequency and voltage and other parameters in the system and phase angle and such are resilient to disturbances, is something that everybody benefits from. And I think it's maybe a trade-off between the solution space. So if it's, for example, if it's simple to just build it out through sort of a centralized approach versus actually getting procurement via a market framework, I think that's kind of, that's the challenge and the complexity of it. I would probably say that for certain types of services, for example, frequency control, there are established frameworks for it and market frameworks or others. But ultimately, I think what you're trying to do is make sure that you get delivery of those services. So I probably just fudged around that answer. I don't probably have a very clear one for that. I don't know, Jacob, you have any thoughts? But yeah, it is. I think it is a complicated question. Unfortunately, not something which we could globally optimize simply because of the complexity of system security.
Okay, I think we're a bit past time, if I have the time correct. So So I want to thank Farhad once again for coming all the way from Australia and for talking with us today.
Thank you.